let's get started. Thanks everybody for joining today's webinar between Horizons Consulting and PowerSync Pro. We're focusing today's webinar on Active Directory migration projects. This is part one of a two-part masterclass tech talk around planning and testing migration scenarios. And we'll have the second registration link at the end of the webinar. But first, let's introduce our Active Directory migration experts. Gary, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've done in your career, and then we'll flip it to Tuan.
So, hi, my name is Gary Cooper. I'm a certified exchange master and certified exchange architect. I've been doing Active Directory. Anyway, as I was saying, I've been with Horizons Consulting for just over 29 years and enjoyed every minute of it. Hopefully, we'll be with them a lot longer. And my expertise goes from Active Directory, Exchange, security, cloud solutions, mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. Tuan?
Thanks, Gary. Here, Tuan Van Beers. I'm the product owner of the PowerSync Pro software. Like Gary, I've been around the block for a while as well. Started back in 1991, certified first in 95 on the Microsoft stack and been on that the whole time. My migration experience not quite as long as Gary's. It's probably around about coming up to 20 years now, I guess. And the last 10 years has been more cloud focused on the tooling side.
Great, thanks guys. It's going to be an interesting session hearing from both of you, and for everyone out there, here's today's agenda. We just did the introduction, so we're going to jump into the complexity of an AD migration project in just a moment. We're going to talk about planning for a successful AD migration, move into best practices for testing scenarios, talk about the AD migration tool and show a demo from PowerSync Pro, finishing up with common issues during AD migrations, and then a Q&A. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be having a live chat. We'll do our best to answer questions as we go, or you could wait to the end and ask your questions there. And again, this is part one of a two-part masterclass. There will be a registration form at the end. So Gary, let's talk about the complexity of an AD migration. Can you talk us through some scenarios and solutions that you've come across?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, I've been doing this for quite a long time and have been feeling the wonderful pressure and stress of companies going through mergers, acquisitions, divestitures. And there's a lot of good to that. It can do a lot of solutions with that for organizations, but there's a lot of things to note. So first of all, what are we even talking about? What is a migration? So it typically occurs when there's a company merger, acquisition, divestiture, or you're trying to do directory consolidations or security changes. It can be as simple as moving things around when restructuring your OUs, but more complex. And the ones that tend to be more fraught with problems are the ones where you have multiple Active Directory domains or forests that you need to move around or consolidate. This is highly visible to the organization. It's highly visible to your CIO and CTO. If not done correctly and not done thoughtfully, it can cause a great deal of stress in your organization, can cause significant outages, so forth. There's also some other considerations on legacy support. What happens if you don't go through this process? You go through a merger or acquisition, so forth, and you don't consolidate your directory. How do you deal with the support implications of that long term? What do you do with old file servers, SQL servers, application servers? Do you have to keep patching them and monitoring and operating them in an indefinite length of time? What about group policies and so forth? So it's a way to get yourself into a more simplistic solution when you do the mergers correctly, so that you don't face all these support issues later on. So as a high level, again, this is only part one. So as a high level, there are generally 6 steps to an entire migration due to these things. One would be to initiate the project itself, which usually entails the project kickoff, assigning group responsibilities, helping people understand what's happening to them and what will be happening, plan this entire migration, test it, pilot it, execute, and then decommission the legacy infrastructures. We're going to today go through the first three. Part 2 in March, we'll be going through the second 3 steps. So stay tuned for those. So again, why just a little bit of review, why do we do this, right? So again, we have mergers, acquisitions, divestitures. We want to consolidate. Sometimes we get calls, a lot of times we get calls because there were a previous merger that never got cleaned up, that there's multitude of domains in force, and it's looking for, they've had, one of the organizations we had a security breach and realized it came in through one of their legacy forests that they weren't really paying too much attention to, but had, of course, a domain or forest level trust, which then the bad actor breached that trust. So there's improving security and your footprint for security, and occasionally for just rebranding. The company doesn't like their domain structure and the naming that people are using to log in. We don't tend to encourage that because this is a fairly significant process to go through, and if it's just simply because of a name, maybe that's not a good enough reason to do it, but it does happen.
And Gary, do you find that those cyber insurance, the prevalence of cyber insurance now also focuses their mind on these kinds of issues?
Absolutely, Tuan. Yeah, cybersecurity insurance has over the last couple of years really focused heavily on how clean is your infrastructure, how easy is it for you to administer and manage it. If you have a whole series of structure out there that's not being carefully administered, or just has some really, really old applications and accounts in it, it can really hurt you with your insurance. In fact, could even cause it to cancel. So it's incredibly important to keep this clean. So what's the kickoff phase? Is it just a single meeting? Well, it starts with that. So first part I would say about this is, and you'll see this again later in the pitfalls, is frequently people like myself or Tuan or you folks in your organizations are brought into the merger acquisition discussion way too late. Budgets have already been set. They've already made decisions, somewhat technical decisions that may not be feasible or may not be accurate. So we suggest you get involved with that kickoff as early as possible. We need to be able to explain the complexity of the activities and the timelines we're talking about. It's very common we see in organizations to shortchange the planning and testing phase and try and get right to the implementation phase, because a lot of the executives will think that, because I hear this a lot, as soon as my email domain changes and I'm now, Gary at abc.com instead of xyz.com, I'm done, right? No, that's just one piece of it. There's a lot more to it than that. So what do the timelines look like? Planning and testing is going to be a significant chunk of time. It should actually be longer than implementation, to be quite honest. We need to be able to clearly outline issues with the current AD environments, right? Both the source environment or multiple source environments and the target. How are they individually secured? How many people are domain admins in each? There's a whole series of conversations around that. And when you're moving these together, the executives need to understand that you're now, as secure as your least secure environment that you're merging. So if the target environment is really, really secure, but the source environment has some more lax security, when you merge these, you're probably going to inherit that lax security or have a tendency to do that. So we need to be aware of that and understand what that means. We often talk with our clients about having an aggressive timeline, meaning that planning and testing will take potentially months, right? Depends on the size and complexity of the merger or the AD migration, but the actual implementation should be rather quickly, right? So if done properly, the actual implementation of, say, moving machines or moving user accounts can take a long weekend, can take a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month, depending on the size and complexity. But one of the things you're going to see later, and we preach this to our clients all the time, once we start executing, first of all, our planning and testing should have already accounted for everything that we know is going to happen. So once we start executing, there shouldn't be a lot of surprises. But if something does occur midway, we don't back up and we don't stop. We fix the problem and keep moving, because the light at the end of the tunnel is where we want to be. That's the sweet spot. So if we don't do those aggressive timelines, then you got to think about, how do I support two separate half migrated organizations long term? And that becomes, where you end up calling folks like Tuan and I to say, hey, I still have these old AD forests, I need to get rid of them. We need to look at the project budget and milestones, and then review roles and responsibilities. If all possible, your executive sponsor should have a fairly active role. They need to be able to evangelize this. They need to be able to support it with good information to their peers and to the board. So it's important to have them on board.
Yeah, I think, Gary, we talked in the past about, companies talk now about agile projects. Everything has to be agile, fail quickly. But yeah, these kinds of project, failure is not an option, right? You can't, like you say, you can't stop.
Correct. Yeah. These are generally not a good solution for agile. So these are more the waterfall. We definitely have a predecessor solution that says, all of these 300 steps need to happen in this sequence, or other things will happen and other issues will occur. So it's really important that we define that as a waterfall. Good point. So then we get to planning. So what's the first part of planning is discovery. Even if you're doing this inside your own organization, one that you've been around for a long time, and maybe you're the creator of their Active Directory environment, there's still discovery and analysis. It would include things like, let's just simply identify what are the source and target environments. How are they going to be connected? How is their direct, and not just, are we going to do a trust or not? Can we do a trust? Oftentimes in a divestiture, a trust may not be possible. But can we, what's the network connectivity going to look like? When will I have a network connectivity so I can start testing? What data will be migrated? That may not be everything. Maybe certain user objects can be deleted, or certain computers can be deleted. What applications, first of all, will be impacted or be migrated? How are they going to be migrated? And what impact does that migration have? So I was on a phone call this morning where we were moving user objects. We validated the application set 3 different times. We were told that the application, being a Linux-based application, wasn't sensitive to the DN of the user, meaning the path that organizational unit that user was in was not important to that application. We moved a few dozen users over a few weeks to test, no problems. We moved the first 495 users, major problems, we need to roll it back. And we're like, well, wait a minute. So those sorts of things need to be understood, and that starts with the discovery. And I would encourage you in the discovery and analysis to lock in who are your key resources, phone numbers, email addresses for all the applications, all the servers. Who are you able to talk to when a problem arises? You can also find that there are applications or services that both source and target organization have, but maybe different solutions. Are you going to use both of them? Are you going to move and have an application expert move their data into the other side, into the target application, or maybe the same solution, but different versions? So all that needs to be hashed out. What about cloud services? This conversation is about AD migrations, but in today's day and age, cloud is part of everyone's life, right? So what do we do with email? What do we do with OneDrive or Planner or SharePoint or Azure services or AWS services or what have you? So there's a lot of things that are part of that. One of the other things you're going to see later too is what do we do with old operating systems? What if there's operating systems in the source that are no longer supported, right? You have Windows XP workstations in a validated environment. You can't just upgrade them. What are you going to do? You're going to find that a lot of migration tools, it just simply won't migrate them. So that becomes a problem you need to solve. What about applications that all have domain admin or server admin and their excessive rights? What about SSL protocols on source workstations? Are they still supporting TLS 1.1 or SSL 3? So all those things need to be addressed and reviewed. So critical activities during the planning phase, once the discovery is done, you need to create project plans. As Twan said, it really should be a waterfall plan. We need to define the individual project steps and what sequence they need to occur in. I mean, at a high level, do you move users first, workstations first? Do you move them together? What happens to their cloud services when you move them? Will they have permissions to everything they need? And so there's all these sorts of questions that need to be addressed in planning. And then later you'll see we need to test all that. We need to have the details of which data servers and services will be migrated and how they're going to be migrated. Will the migration tool handle it? Is it possible, for example, SharePoint on-prem? You can't move that from one force to another. It's not allowed. SharePoint doesn't tolerate that. So I can do a backup of the data sets, or I can then restore it elsewhere. I can try and move the individual data points. So those considerations need to come about. So how you're going to do that migration of that data. What licenses? Great example. We've had this multiple times with cloud services. You each source and target have just the right number of licenses. You don't have an excess amount of licenses for your users to have Office 365 and so forth. But when you're creating and merging those users in the source into the target, you're going to have to double those licenses. You're going to have to add more. Do you want to pay for those for a year? Frequently, Microsoft, an example, will, for 90 days, allow you to add licenses at no additional cost, knowing that you're already paying for it in the source. But what if you need longer than 90 days? So there, those kind of conversations need to happen. You need to have that migration schedule fairly locked in, although it can change. It needs to be locked in. You need to have a list of your subject matter experts and all the different components of this, and a tiered list of applications. There will be, and I say a tiered list because there will be Sev1 applications that if they go bad, it costs the organization millions of dollars a day. Those need to be, kit glove handled. They need to be treated with a lot of more respect than say a tier 4, which is nice to have, but not that critical. What about your PKI infrastructure? What if you have 802.1x in the target environment that requires your machine to have a certificate assigned by Active Directory? How does it get on the network if it's not part of the Active Directory? So those sorts of things come up. And then obviously milestones for migration activities, specifically so that your executive sponsors can report back to the organization how you're doing. Then we get into testing, right? So you will have picked a migration tool like PowerSync Pro at this point. You implement that tool. You start testing your theories, creating test accounts, getting test devices, test machines, if possible, get test SQL servers and test SharePoint, as much infrastructure that you can build that is already been built for you, that if it gets damaged, it's not that big a deal because it's a test environment. So we need to go through that and understand what features do you need in a migration tool that maybe it doesn't support. Maybe there isn't a way to migrate certain things. You need to know what those limitations are. Do you need to make modifications to a device or to a service? One of the examples we've had a problem with in the past is some antivirus or anti-malware software will stop a migration tool dead in its tracks. So we may have to temporarily uninstall that, quickly migrate the machine, and then reinstall an anti-malware solution. Is there older data that can be deleted? If you don't have to migrate it, it makes it a lot easier and a lot smoother. So look for empty groups, disabled accounts, old files, whatever can be deleted should be at this point. Why carry trash with you into the new environment? How do you do printer migrations? How are your printers even addressed, right? Are they a collective set of migrations with a large batching system? There's a lot of third-party software that do that. Or are they individually assigned to users' desks, or how does that occur? SQL. We've had lots and lots of fun with SQL, especially SQL clustering. So be aware that, understand that you have to test that extensively. You have to test schema changes if there's applications that need to add schema entries to the target directory. We will go into more detail on this later, but a lot of old knowledge says we'll use SID history to give us the ability to not worry about if once I've moved users and computers and servers, that the user would still have access to that based on that SID history. It's actually better. If you do that, you need to be able to get rid of SID history, which is always really hard. So we recommend using a little bit more modern technique of reackling the objects, basically adding permissions for the target accounts and then eventually removing the original source accounts. And that way you don't have that SID history legacy to live with. And then finally, what are we going to do with the cloud services and data? There are some things that simply aren't able to be migrated. For example, Microsoft Planner. Some of the Teams chats and so forth can be migrated, but the method they're migrated may not be what the user is expecting. So that needs to be tested and understood. And so now I wanted to talk a little bit and hand this over to Tuan to kind of show you what PowerSync Pro offers along these lines and why I think they're a really good solution for most of you.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, so PowerSync Pro. It was originally written back in 2018. It started off, I wrote it as a PowerShell script and used it to migrate about half a dozen or so companies that year. And then we decided to make it into an actual product. So it's now a .NET application. It's got a web server, a SQL backend, and then the migration agents that talk to it to find out what it is they need to do. One thing we're just adding now is also remote agents so that you can synchronize disconnected networks, and the PowerSync Pro server itself doesn't actually need to know the password of the directory that it's talking to. So kind of decoupling that. The big thing with the tool was that we wanted it to be easy to configure, flexible. So we've got things like complex expressions to manipulate the attributes on the fly, and we want obviously to scale. So the largest sync that we've got going at the moment is roughly about 500,000-600,000 objects. I think it's something like 20 million attributes, and they synchronize on a 15-minute interval, and it takes about a minute to go through the 14 Active Directory forest, or Active Directory domain, sorry, to find the deltas and apply them to the target. So we know it operates at scale. And then the other thing we want to make sure is that it's safe. So when you make changes, there is a planning report, so you can have a look at the what if. So if I make this change, what is going to happen? Like when I next sync it, which objects are going to get deleted or updated? So if I take you to the demo now, so thank you, Gary. I'll take over the screen and just grab that out of the way. And get my screen up. There you go. Get Teams out of the way. We don't need to look at my face. So this is the user interface of PowerSync Pro, the actual backend service. So it runs as a web service. It's hosted in Kestrel, but often we use a web reverse proxy to present it out as an SSL connection. In this session, I'll talk more about the sync service, and then in the next session, I'll review the sync service, but then talk more about the migration agent, the one that does the workstation moves. In the synchronization service, everything comes down to a synchronization profile, where you say, which objects you want to sync, how you want to match them to a possible existing target object, and then what you want to do with those attributes. When you first come in here, the first thing you'll need to do is set up your directories. So what are you connecting to? Obviously, we've got some Azure Entra ones here as well as Active Directory. They operate in a similar way, just different credentials. And you specify the name of the DC you want to talk to, the user account and the password, and then you can specify a port if you've customized a port, or click the SSL button if you want to do LDAP over SSL. As I say, we've added a remote agent capability, so you can hide these credentials from this server. So if the server you want it to be in a DMZ, you can put it there, and it doesn't need direct access to any domain controller at all. The remote agents can be on the network side, on the domain controller side, and they talk through port 443 back to the service. We have the concept of an export deletion threshold, which is similar to Azure AD Connect, where if we see there's more than in this case 100 deletions pending, we'll stop the export and just log a message in the event log, so that someone can just check whether that's an expected set of deletions. The import object types, they are more a performance thing. If you're only interested in syncing users, then no point importing all the other objects. For larger engagements, we typically import all of them. PowerSync Pro has a metaverse concept, so we import everything from the source and target directories and then manipulate it inside the solution itself. So you'll hear a lot of talk about import, sync, and export. Once you've got your directory set up, the next thing is your sync profiles. So when you create a sync profile, I'll just take it through the motion. There are some templates, so you can say, okay, I'm syncing Active Directory to Active Directory. I want to sync users, and it will kind of populate the screens for you with typical mappings and setups. But if I take you to an existing profile, this is just a user profile. So in this case, we're syncing from the source domain to the target domain. We're interested in syncing users. In this case, we want to create or update, but you can say, actually, I want to only create new users. If there's an existing user that's conflicting, just log an error. Or conversely, I only want to update. There's something else that's creating these users, and I just want to update to it. Or in some cases, the directory sync is done by something else, and you still want to use the migration agent. You can just say, well, I just want to match them up so that we know which SIT in the source becomes which SIT in the target. So we can do the re-ACLing that Gary's talking about for the Windows profile, as well as files and registry locations. The scoping itself is around OUs to begin with. So you select the source containers that you want this profile to look in, and you nominate a target container where you want, in this case, the created user objects, if there are any to be created, where you want them placed. The tick boxes below allow you to copy some of the source OU structure from the source to the target, so you can have the same structure and apply the GPOs that were applied in the source to give you a more quick and dirty type migration. And then you can refine that by using inclusion attributes, exclusion attributes, and complex expressions. Now, an inclusion attribute would be something like department equals finance. So you set the attribute to department, you add a value and call it finance, and it will pick up only users in those OUs that have department set to finance. Or you can do it the other way around. You can pick up all users and set an exclusion attribute like extension attribute 1. If that's set to don't sync, then it's not going to sync it. And then a more complex solution, which I'll talk to in a moment, where you can use if then else type expressions to make a much more complex and much more precise scope of your objects. The matching is when we find when we have a source object, in this case a source user, can we check in the target to see if there's actually already a pre-created user, in this case with the same SAM account name. We can manipulate these, so we sometimes see things like we want to use the left part of the UPN or the left part of the email address to match those. And again, we can use complex expressions, and I'll show you some in a moment. So this is all about matching, and you can have multiples of these. You don't have to just have one, so they just fall down in a priority order. it will check on SAM account name first. If it can't find an exact match, it will go to the next until it runs out of options. The mapping is, okay, so I've got an object in the target. I've got all these attributes that I want to populate. What do I populate it with? Often it's just source to target, so CN to CN, name to name. But then in some cases, like in this user principal name, we use a complex expression to take the left part of the UPN and add the domain from the target onto the right. So we can change things on the fly. There's quite a lot here that comes through. We have got simple expressions as well, and they're only called simple expressions because they are simpler in nature, but they just run slightly faster. So we can do things like uppercase, lowercase, prefix, suffix, replace strings, add strings, whereas the complex expressions can do much more than that. Synchronization options. So this is where we've got things like sync password, sync set history, which you can turn on or off. Obviously, there's requirements on the service account for permissions, etc. And delete target objects. So when an object drops out of scope, so when it's moved from the source OU that you're looking at to a different OU, or it's deleted, do you want Passing Pro to delete the target as well? If you have it ticked, it will delete it. If you don't, it won't. If you do delete a target object and there's an object in the source in scope for migration that used to be linked to that object, it will go and grab it out of the recycle bin and reanimate it so that you don't get into the problem where you've accidentally caused a deletion to happen, you revert it, and you've all of a sudden got a whole lot of new objects. It will reanimate the old ones so they connect properly with the likes of Azure AD Connect up to the tenant and everything's back how you expect. When you're doing groups, you can obviously choose to synchronize group members, and you can choose whether you want any changes that are made to the target group where a non-migrated user has been added into the group, whether you want those left or whether you always want to revert back to the group membership as it is in the source. And then the last option on the screen is converting contacts. So when you're matching, you can choose to match object type to object type, user to user, or you can match to a contact as well. And then we can convert that contact to a user. So if you have the old style where in Domino days, they used to sometimes create contacts in AD, and we can combine them back with the user. And so you've got a more traditional Active Directory setup. The last two tabs here are just specific objects where, in this case, whether the account's enabled, we can choose to always enable them or always disable them, as well as flow them from the source to the target. And then on update, we have an extra option to keep it as is. So you might want to start with everything disabled on the target, but then you manually enable accounts on the target as users are migrated, and you don't want to flow that that attribute or that portion of the attribute across from the source anymore. And a similar idea for some of the mail attributes. So whether an object's mail enabled, whether exchange address policies are enabled, or whether hide from GAL is set. We can choose to always enable, always disable, flow from the source, or keep them as they are on the target. Just by creating the sync profiles, and you'll see that some of these have got exclude from schedule. Any that are not excluded from schedule, that's how this schedule is built up. So you don't have to do anything to build this tree structure. Passing Pro takes care of that in the background. And with the schedule, by default, we run it every 30 minutes, but you can choose to run that more often or less often. And if you don't like an interval based, you can actually set the exact time of days that you want us to start. I mentioned complex expressions. So if I look at this group scoping one, so this is a scoping expression. So in this case, we take the groups and we look at the CN attribute. If the CN attribute contains the letters TVB, then it's included. Or if the mail attribute contains marketing, it's still included. Otherwise, we don't have it in scope for that profile. So you can get quite granular about exactly what you want to include. And then for the mapping ones, things get interesting. We can do more complicated things. So we've got the if then else structure. But then for the target value, we can use a subset of C# code to actually manipulate the source value. So in this case, this is looking at the consistency GUID. So if the MSDS consistency GUID is null, we take the object GUID and convert it to an immutable ID. Otherwise, if it's not null, we'll take the consistency GUID and convert it to an object ID, as converted to an immutable ID, sorry. And then the other example I was going to show is the splitting. So taking the left part of an attribute, in this case, the male value, splitting it on the @ sign, taking the first part of that, the first part of the array, and adding a new domain to the end. So you can get quite creative about what you need to get done. You can, in the target value, you can actually put the word target value, and what that would do is it would effectively leave the target value alone. It would just, if the target value was already set to males at something, in this case, it would just ignore this rule and leave it alone. In terms of running the schedule, it runs in parallel. So when you start this, it first runs the import containers jobs for any domains all at the same time. Then we'll run the imports, and as soon as the imports is finished, it'll start running the syncs for as many as it can at the same time, and then does the exports. Now, if we make a change, so if I go to the source DC, I changed this earlier for another demo. So let me take display name off for that guy, go back in here and force it to run again. It's going to pick up that change, but in this case, we're going to just cancel the export, leave that to not export. So we're just importing the change, synchronizing it. And what we can do now is we can have a look, okay, well, what would happen the next time we do an export? Users. So, okay, it's found one user that it needs to update, and we can see it's going to update the display name. It's going to remove Joe Bloggs test, and it's going to insert Joe Bloggs instead. We can also do that by looking at a single object report. So we can say, okay, in the source, let's look for Joe Bloggs, search for him, find him. So in this case, we see that Joe Bloggs in the source is tied to this object in the target. We can see that there's an update pending. And then when we go to attributes, we can see that there's just one attribute being updated in this case. We can see other things. So we've added in a capability where we actually harvest the user profile of all machines that are running the migration agents. So you can see on those machines which users have logged into those machines, when did they last log on, what's their profile path, etc. And that may help with deciding which machines to migrate. We find that sometimes when we go into organizations, they know their list of machines, they know their list of users, but they don't have an accurate record of which user is actually using which machine. So that tries to help with that. If there are any errors for the user, it will show up in here, so you can actually see what's going on for that user, why they're not syncing. Things like the user object already exists because the SAM account name is duplicated. That's a common one when we merge different domains into a single new domain. The message log, so when we do the sync, we do record a lot of information. This log is purged on a 7-day cycle, so you won't see messages here older than 7 days. You can purge that completely if you want, and you've got the option to filter. The better way to do this filtering, though, is from the schedule. So when there are errors, the number here will be something other than 0. It will be a hyperlink. You can click on the hyperlink, and it goes to the log report with just those errors or warnings shown there. Trying to think if I can take you through something else quickly. SMTP domains is about the proxy addresses. So in AD to AD migrations, we often take the proxy addresses mostly as are, but you can filter what you take from the proxy address. So in this case, it's set up to take SMTP, X500, and SIP protocols. It's not taking X400. So if there's any X400, they're left behind. Then for SMTP and SIP, we can then also say, well, which domains do we want to take out of that? So in this case, we're only taking those 2 domains from the proxy addresses. Any other proxy addresses can stay in the source, but we're not going to bother syncing them. And where that's useful sometimes is when you do tenant-to-tenant migrations, where the domain can only be in one tenant. We can import all the information, but hold off syncing until the domain is in the target, and then let it flow through, and it'll flow through Azure AD Connect or Intra Connect Sync, and get up into the cloud. So it's a very quick whirlwind tour of PowerSync Pro. It is flexible, like we even do Google ingestion as well, importing from Google to the tenant or to AD, between ADs, AD to Azure, Azure to AD. So there's lots of flexibility in the tool. So I'll hand you back to Gary to carry on with the webinar.
Thank you, Tuan. Let me jump to where we were. So lastly, before we get to a question and answer, is just some things that we see, and this is not an exhaustive list. These are things that we see more commonly, but things that are important nonetheless. So first one is when you have synced the source user accounts to the target, if they're active, and they might need to be activated immediately because maybe there's an application that some users or all users need to start using. But once they're active, it's somewhat common for users to try and log into their Windows workstation with that new account. What that does then is it creates a Windows profile in that target user's workstation. Many migration tools will completely fail to migrate that machine or that profile when that occurs. Now, Tuan, I think in your tool, you have a way around that, correct?
Yeah, that's right. We used to come across this, and it's quite annoying because you don't find out until you go to migrate the machine, and if you don't have access, it's a pain. So what we do is we still migrate the user's profile, so their old profile gets tied to their new account, and the new profile that was there before is just left there as a directory. So if there are files, they can still drag them back, but at least they're now logging in with the profile that looks mostly like their migrated account.
Excellent. Anti-malware, as I mentioned earlier, has stopped migrations dead in their tracks. It may be such that the source anti-malware needs to be removed anyway because the target environment uses a different flavor, different brand, different version, what have you. So that needs to be addressed. And a quality migration tool will allow you to script the ability to do that on the fly. So as the workstation migration is beginning, it will actually do whatever you need it to do, uninstall something, what have you, do the migration for you, and then continue on. So, which I know PowerSync Pro has that ability through scripting. Be aware, we've run into this a few times as well. If the target network environment uses 802.1x certificates from their internal PKI, frequently those certificates are assigned as an Active Directory process in the target Active Directory. But how would that machine get that certificate if it's not yet in the directory, but yet it's trying to be on the network? So you have to kind of work through those loopholes, kind of the, if you will, the chicken and the egg approach, right? In some cases, we've either asked the network security team to not only require 802.1x certificates to get on, or to provide a remediation network during the migration so we can get the machine in the domain, thus getting it a certificate. In today's day and age, you got a lot of remote workers probably. And what happens if that remote worker's migration doesn't quite go smoothly, and we need to remediate it by hand, right? It's out of the source domain. It couldn't join the target. It's in kind of a limbo state. How do you remotely connect to it? If you're using RDP that's domain joined, that's not going to work. So do you have a replacement device available for that user? How far are they from your nearest office, right? Can they drive in and get on the network to do that? Or are they hours and hours away? So those sorts of things need to be thought through and addressed and be ready for. User communication. we haven't probably stressed that enough, but it is nearly impossible to over communicate what's about to happen to a user's machine, their email, their websites, whatever activities they typically do, and communicating in multiple methods. So we've had placards left on lunch tables. We've had handouts at everyone's desk. We've had email blasts, TV blasts on their internal television networks. We've done tons, and we've done lunch and learns. We've done tons of ways to get the communication to the user and what their job is, because they may need to clean up some data. They may need to do certain pre-activities potentially, or it may be that, hey, we're going to do this at noon while you're at lunch. Just reboot your machine once to have a nice clean boot and walk off, right? And when you come back, it'll be done. So what is their role in this? What if you are migrating a huge portion of remote users? Can you do an offline domain join or pre-stage these objects? If they have no connectivity, say maybe the VPN is dependent upon the domain, but you just remove them from your domain, how do they do that? So those sorts of things can be addressed. There are some migration tools, typically older ones, or like Microsoft's free one, that has very little reporting. And I'm talking about not just detail logging, like Tuan had suggested in his tool in the migration PowerSync Pro, but also managerial reports. How many objects have we synced? How many objects have we moved successfully, so that your executive sponsors can talk about that and say how wonderful it's doing. As I mentioned before, what about out-of-support operating systems? A lot of migration tools simply don't migrate them. What do you do, right? How do you address that? And then migration budgets. Again, those frequently are inadequate. So that's all that I wanted to talk through. What questions and answers, or what questions do you have that we can answer?
Yeah, please put them in the chat window if you have questions and answers, or questions, I guess. We'll give the answers back. I do have a couple, Gary, that we did collect originally. I had one that came in through email. My AD is quite unique. My AD setup is quite unique. How can I mold the migration process to cover what I need to?
That all goes back. Go ahead. Sorry, Tom.
You're gone.
No, go ahead.
So that's talking again mostly about the migration agent side there, where there's something on the machine that's different. So Gary mentioned malware as a possible. We've seen all kinds of things where an application has to get uninstalled because it's not allowed to be used outside of the source environment. So the good thing with the PowerSync Pro migration agent is you've got two places. You can add a zip file in to run at the start, and there's a bootstrap file called commandline.cmd that you can run anything as system effectively on the machine. So you can run any PowerShell, any command line, any small applications you can deploy through there. And you can have a similar one at the end. So when the migration is completed, when you're on the target, it can run again. So you've got two places that you can add customization.
Excellent. Thank you, Duan.
Great. I'm going to ask one more. Before I do so, I'm going to put the registration link right in the chat window right now for part 2 of the AD Migration Masterclass for March 20th. So please take a moment to register, and we'll see you again for part 2. Here's the second question. You talk about reackle. What does that mean, and how does it work?
Excellent question. So access control list is what ACL stands for. It's an acronym. So if we look at permissions that are on files or directory objects or servers or what have you, those are access control lists. It says that, Gary and Tuan and Carl have certain rights to this object. Those in an Active Directory environment are tied to the Active Directory user or computer or server in that environment. But now I'm going to move all that to a new environment where the reference material, known as a SID, is no longer really valid in the new environment, because a SID is unique to the environment it started in. So One way to do that is with SID history. So basically grabbing the original secure ID from the source object, source user, for example, and adding it as a SID history property on the target. And that does work, right? I'm not going to say that it doesn't work. It does. The thing that introduces, though, is when do you get rid of that? If you've never taken the next step to remove the original permission and replace it with the current correct target permission, that SID history can remain indefinitely. We've gone into organizations where 10, 15, 20 years later, that SID history is still there. In fact, it has multiple. So what do we do now, right? The problem that poses is that can open up security risks, and that SID history not really clearly being understood can be used by a bad actor to gain access. So the better option is to take that access control list and update it. So the process is twofold. Step one is find every permission that's in the target environment. So you know that in the source servers, and find that SID. Go find the matching account in the target and add its SID with the exact same permission. So it's not destructive. The original permission is still intact. We've just added a representation of that user from the target environment. Then at a later point, we go through, once we verified that the users have been migrated and everything's happy, we then start to remove the old SID permissions from the ACL and therefore clean up that history. Hopefully that wasn't too technical, too descriptive.
No, I thought that was good. We'll do one more and then we'll move through. What is, I think you may have answered this one, or it could tie in. What is wrong with using SID history long term?
It's still a good question. I mean, if you have a plan to quickly remove SID history, it's not a problem. The problem we find is that bad actors tend to use or can use SID history to gain inappropriate access and do lateral movement within your infrastructure. And once it's there, it's really, really hard to understand how to get rid of it. How do you really know that old SID is not used somewhere? The thing that actually knows when it's used, honestly, is the migration tool, right? So, because it's the one that can see everything in both environments. It walks through all the permissions. It knows what's where. The problem is that you've probably decommissioned that migration tool 5 years later. So now how do you know where that SID is actually in use? And that becomes really complex and frankly is usually why SID history never goes away.
Yeah, and it used to also be a problem with token bloat, didn't it? Where
Yeah,
the token just increases.
exactly.
Great, thanks, Gary. Maybe we just move to the last slide and sum it up.
It's just a reminder to register for part 2, where we're going to go through the implementation, execution of the migration, and decommissioning and so forth. And I wish to thank everyone for joining.
Yes, thanks everyone for joining. We look forward to hosting again in part 2 of the Active Directory Masterclass with both Gary and Tuan. I was told that the link wasn't necessarily working that I posted, so I'm going to try to do it again here in just a second. So if you hang on with me, we'll also be sending out all of the PowerPoint slides and video recording to this webinar session early next week. So again, thanks for joining, everybody. If you just give me a second, I'm going to try to pop that other link here in just a moment. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.